Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Well, hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan. It's summertime. That means it's hay season.
Oh, yeah, we are in the middle of hay season for sure. Second cutting and first cutting seemed to go pretty good. Second cutting seemed to have some issues, but we are at that halfway point. And again, we always talk about how much the weather affects the different cuttings and the harvest and the quality. And it's just amazing to me, like the differences in rain that we are getting even within the same state. You know, we said it last week, but it still holds true this week. There was that devastating flood down in southern West Virginia the past couple of days, or this past week. And, they just got mudslides and flooding. And up here, I measured about 1/8 of an inch all week.
Yeah, I don't even know if we got that much where I am. So it's definitely been spotty and too much of a good thing and too little of a good thing, you know?
Yeah, and it's these natural disasters are just terrible, and it's a whole different show on how to deal with natural disasters. But the weather does often just about always. I don't think there is an agricultural product that is immune from the weather unless it's grown indoors. But the sun could be a factor unless you have lights. So I guess you can get away from weather altogether, but it's very rare in specific cases.
Yeah. And for those who are down in southern West Virginia and had to deal with some flooding, you have to keep in mind that there's a difference between flash floods that come down off the top of the mountain and floods that come up out of the creek bed or out of the river. And they both offer different dangers, but the ones that come up out of the creek bed and out of the river also carry with them bacteriological and chemical dangers, in addition to the flowing water that can wash things away. So you have to be careful, especially if your hay got wet or your pasture. And you'll want to make sure that you are following the proper steps to either remedy the potential problems associated with those floodwaters, or to just, unfortunately, if your hay was saturated, you have to dispose of that. It's considered adulterated, and you can have all sorts of problems with mycotoxins and other nastiness that can kill your cattle. So it's unfortunately lost. So if you did lose hay, always make sure you contact your FSA office and report those losses to them. And hopefully you can get some cash back to help cover those losses.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. I just find it really interesting that this year, more so than most years that I can remember, such spotty weather differences, just extreme differences, and very geographic and very small area. So it's just, one part of the state's flooding and the other one is just dry.
Yeah. So if you have questions about your flooded forage or your flooded hay, reach out to your local extension office. We also have a great webpage up about that information and how you can determine whether or not your bales are still safe. And if you just search for WVU Extension, hay and flood, you'll find it. So check that out.
So let's talk a little bit about hay quality in general, and then how rains can affect the quality.
Even without flooding.
Yeah, even without flooding. Yeah, with flooding, basically, it's no good at all. So, but there is some data out there to kind of show some percentage degradation from what it started off as, and whether you're willing to take the chance and using it or not, depending on when it got rained on, when it was baled, and what stage. So let's start with the relationship between growth stage, yield, and quality, because that's always where things start. we always say the best thing to do is to graze. Why? Because grazing is forage at its highest quality, but it's only available during the grazing season. So in order to be able to feed when grazing is not an option, we bale hay and we basically preserve as many nutrients as we can. But in doing so, with any preserved product, you're going to have some losses, and those losses are always set from the starting point. So you're going to have some losses when you preserve, but then you'll have it available to you when grazing is not an option. But again, you have that gradient of starting, right? So when we talk about growth stage and quality and yield, you're going to have the lowest yield, but the highest quality at vegetative growth. We see a lot of that in the second cutting when you're kind of past that whole reproductive cycle for most cool season forages. So you'll get typically lower yields in second and third cutting, but you'll have better quality than the first cutting. So you're going to have highest quality, lowest quantity when it's vegetative. Then you go to bud stage, which is kind of the next marker that we say is going to affect quality, where yield goes up pretty significantly, but then there's that drop in quality. First flower, you're still doing really good with quality. So we could talk about seed heads too. This is both for forages and alfalfa. So full bloom and then post seed head / post flower, depending if you're looking at alfalfa. And everything starts to drop after flowering, after the seed head stage. And the longer you let that go, the more lignin you're going to get, the less moisture you're going to have. So it's just going to be lower quality, but it will be high quantity. So we always strive for just that transition stage, even a little bit before that transition stage, where we can capture some of that quantity, but then have the quality necessary for good hay production. And one of the things that we can look at when we do this, especially if you're starting from scratch, is to see what kind of seeds you have. We always want to push newer varieties of forages, whether we're talking orchard grass, whether we're talking about fescue, whether we're talking about alfalfa. There was a shift in research in the 90s where we stopped breeding grass for seed amounts and we started breeding grass for persistence and vegetative timing. So how long they're vegetative and before they go reproductive, because that's what it's really about. It's not about how many seeds you can make on your forage crop. It's about the quality. So we started breeding newer varieties for longevity in vegetative and persistence with competition weeds and disease pressures. So by using novel seeds, you're going to get better quality. So anytime you're buying seed, make sure you're buying the newer varieties. Again, whether you're talking orchard grass, whether you're talking fescue or alfalfa, you always want the newer varieties for better vegetative persistence.
Yep, absolutely. Those new varieties do make a difference. And also reseeding is sometimes important to do as well. If your stands are getting a little thin or you just removed a lot of weed cover, reseeding is going to be essential to help reduce additional weed cover to come in. And we'll talk a little bit more about your seeds and how to get a good reestablishment later on this year when it gets a little closer to planting time. But we want to focus more today on how to get your hay up and maintain those nutrients, that all the nutrients you can, because like Dan said earlier, you will lose some. But there's steps you can take to make sure that you have the best quality hay in the end by just changing a few steps in your harvest. And one of those things is going to be harvesting at the right stage. Like Dan was explaining, the closer to the vegetative stage, the better quality that hay is going to be. And the higher quality the hay is at harvest means that you're going to have a higher quality hay after the initial sweating has happened, where the microbes are digesting the easiest stuff to digest. And you'll have a higher nutrient quality or content after that stage if you start off at a higher level.
Right, that's true. And also like what's in that mixture as well. So when you are harvesting hay, no matter what stage you're in, the grazing slash clipping height affects the grass legume balance that we often refer to. We often say that legumes are great because they will increase quality. They'll just add that diversity to your pasture. They add nitrogen because you're going to have a lot of nitrogen loss when you are removing any kind of product from your field. So if you're baling the hay and removing it, you are losing nitrogen, you're losing phosphorus, you're losing potassium. But having a good relationship between grasses and clover is a great way to at least maintain that nitrogen. So one of the things you have to understand is depending on how close you're clipping that cutting is going to depend on whether you're going to see more legumes persist or less legumes persist. If you are cutting down to 1 or 2 inches when you're baling hay, and 1 inch is really close. 2 inches is what I would recommend as far as a maximum goes. But when you're cutting down to 2 inches and down, what you're doing is you are selecting for more legumes. So when you get that regrowth, you're going to have a mixture of legumes and you're going to have a mixture of grasses. So you're going to get more legumes in that subsequent cutting. If you are cutting at 2 inches and higher, so over 2 inches, we'll say, what you're going to see is you're going to get more grasses and less legumes. So, that depends on the history of the field. If there are legumes in that field, you can actually manage it so that you have more legumes in the following cutting by adjusting that height. If there isn't, you can actually manage the weeds and the density of the grasses by keeping that cutting a little bit higher. So, that is something to think about when you're harvesting, and also something to think about when you are adjusting the height on a specific field, which is just a great way to either increase biomass or increase quality by having more legumes in the subsequent cutting by keeping that cutting a little bit lower.
Yeah. You really need to measure your height based on your field needs. Now, the clovers we were just talking about were white clovers, which are rhizomial spreaders. Is that the right word for that?
Yeah.
They spread by rhizomes. So for them, they're going to stay a little bit lower to the ground, whereas your red clovers are going to grow up a little bit higher. And those will need to be reseeded. And when you're thinking about, if you have, let's just say it's really dry, right? And you're trying to get your hay up, but it's been really dry and there's a lot of dust. So you don't want a whole lot of dust in your hay because that's going to increase the ash content, reduce the digestibility and the palatability. So if you even leave up maybe even 3 inches, that is going to make it so that when you're pulling your hay up, you're actually going to get less soil, less of that ash content that is going to come up. So, think about the situations of when you're harvesting your hay, when you're baling it, and what's going on in your field. What species do you have? And make your adjustments based on all of those things.
That's right. And that's just another thing to take into account. And again, that's going to be very field specific. And I would not recommend a shorter cutting on a very weedy field. So be aware of that too, because you can bring up some weeds and that's going to give you problems as well. Because the best solution to a weed problem is just having a nice, dense, thick sod of grass to keep the weeds smothered.
Now, if you already have a weed problem, and let's say you want to deal with some ironweed or something, then if you cut it, the ironweed will shoot up, and then you could use a weed wiper to get it before the grass catches up. And so that is a potential reason, but I still wouldn't cut too short, just because you don't want to damage the base of the hay. You want to give it a good opportunity to regrow.
One of the things that we did want to discuss as well is, what if it rains, right? Mm-hmm. We do have some dry matter loss percentages that we can kind of talk about, just as far as how much loss you have when it rains. So one of the aspects of curing hay is to preserve those nutrients and to dry them down in a timely manner so that they get dry enough that all the metabolism going on subsides, and then you'll have something that's preserved, something you can store, and something that'll maintain that quality months, possibly years down the road, so that when you're feeding something to your animals, that it's going to be maintained, especially if it's stored properly. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So let's say it takes about 3-4 days to cure something, and you cut your field. You could have tedded it, maybe not, but it's just out there. And you get the first amount, you get 1 inch of rain. Well, there are these standard rules about 1 inch of rain, where you're going to get a dry matter loss of anywhere from 8 to 17%. Your crude protein is going to shift 1.5-2% units, your NDF 6%. So you're going to increase your NDF by 6%, and you're going to decrease your total digestible nutrients by 7%. But it really does matter when that rain comes. So, for instance, if you were to cut that field on day 1, when the moisture level of your grass is at 70%, and you need to cure it down to 20%, right? 20% is what we say. That bale shouldn't be any higher than 20% moisture. Otherwise, you'll get mold and you'll get even more problems. It won't preserve correctly. But at 70% moisture, if you get 1 inch of rain, as far as a dry matter loss, we are typically looking at about a 10% loss, which honestly isn't too bad. If it's going to rain, the best scenario you can have is if it rains on the day that you cut.
Right.
2 days in, you might be at 50% moisture, and then you get 1 inch of rain, and you're probably looking at a 20% loss. On a third day, if you get 1 inch of rain at 30%, so right before you're going to bale it, you're looking at a 25% higher dry matter loss. And don't forget, then you have to wait longer to be able to bale it so that it does get to the right moisture level. So you're going to get the biggest loss when that hay's been sitting out the longest. So the drier it is, when you get that rain, the greater loss you're going to have. And depending on when that rain came, might really affect how you're going to use that hay.
Right. Yeah. And you also, you want to think about why does this happen? Why do you lose that quality? And there's a couple reasons for that. And one of them is simply the drier the leaves are, the more fragile they are, the more likely they are to get shattered in the baling process. But the rain can also break them off. But as you increase that moisture, that reinvigorates the decay on that plant. And so those microbes become more active. They start eating the plant material again. And then therefore you're going to lose more of your forage quality based on something else is eating the hay rather than your livestock.
Yeah, so you got to pay attention to all kinds of things when you're talking about environmental factors that affect the drying rate, because that drying rate's really going to set the tone for the quality as far as quality loss from cut to finish. When we're talking about favorable things that affect drying rate, we're talking about full sun. So you want sunshine, which is radiant energy. You typically want low relative humidity because that's just going to remove the moisture faster.
Mm-hmm.
You want some warm air temperatures to kind of keep more of that heat, helping move some of that moisture out. Wind is a great thing. Having wind really dries things quickly. So a nice breeze and a full sunshine is going to also increase the rate of drying for that grass that you cut. And in soil moisture. So you don't necessarily want to be out there when everything's wet and put the grass on wet ground to dry. If that soil is nice and dry, you got full sunshine and a nice wind, a nice breeze, that's going to cure things really quickly, or it's going to dry things down really quickly so that they are cured. And when you bale it, you're going to have the least amount of loss from that starting point. Again, when we're talking about the stage of cut.
And, there's debates on whether or not tedding the hay is recommended. And it's going to come down to your individual situation. So if you have a high legume content, if it's fairly dry, then tedding can actually reduce your hay quality by breaking up those leaves. And so tedding needs to be done based on how moist the grasses are and what your quantity of legumes are, because that way you can make that judgment. You don't necessarily need to ted your hay, but if it's really moist out and you're having a hard time getting it to dry, that can help speed up the drying process. So again, it's very situational based, and you need to make that decision when the time comes.
That's right. And conditioners are another thing to look at. You can have flail type conditioners, or you can have those rubber rolls that kind of crush things. So flails will kind of strip things. It has a high capacity, but it does cause higher legume leaf losses. And it's more designed for grasses. When you have the rubber rolls that crush things, they're great for legumes. They are good with rotary blades, and what they'll do is they'll crush stems so that they do dry faster. But one of the things that you'll see the difference between grasses and alfalfa is that the rollers work better for alfalfa on how quickly it can dry, but for the grasses, you're going to have better with the impellers, the flail types, because you won't lose as much leaf matter when you are drying them. So, as far as the research goes, we're looking at the rollers being better for alfalfa type hay. And then you have the flail impeller types that are going to be better for grasses.
Yeah, and I don't see a whole lot of either of those in this area. Do you?
Typically, the new balers do have a lot of these type of conditioners built into them. So you might have something. If you're looking at new equipment, you might have to make that choice whether you want to get a conditioner or not.
Okay.
But it is something to consider, especially if you know what kind of grasses you're going to have. If you're doing alfalfa versus if you have mainly mixed type grasses, it can make a difference whether you get the rolls or the impalers. So there are all these different things that affect the quality of hay, from a cutting to when it's baled. But that's not the end of the story. We also have to store that hay, because you don't want to be feeding hay when that could be used for grazing, right? The idea of hay is to be able to feed it when you can't graze, because there's obviously that economic impact of making hay, whether it's running the equipment through, whether it's baling, either way, every stage you're going to run equipment, and you're also going to have a loss of quality because you are preserving that product. So there's a cost associated with making hay. So what we always say is the most economic beneficial thing to do for livestock is to graze. But of course, we can't always graze. So we make hay because we got to feed our animals in the winter. However, that's not the end of the story. You make those bales, but then you have to hold on to them until you need them. So storing has a major impact on quality.
That's right. And you want to make sure that you're protecting it from moisture first and foremost. Moisture from the ground by putting it up on either gravel, on pallets, or on a concrete surface, and protecting them from moisture from the surface, which is be a roof or tarps, or wrapping it. So wrapping it's the most common that I see in this area if you don't have a hay barn. So a hay barn obviously is going to be the best choice for maintaining your quality, but it's not always within everyone's budget. And so wrapping it, or even just throwing a tarp over it to reduce the amount of moisture that's getting on it, making sure you're wrapping the bales tightly. If you're using a round baler, make sure it's wrapping tightly so that water sheds off more easily, and also making sure that you are storing it in a location where water isn't going to rise up and hit it from the bottom.
Exactly. And the spoilage associated with the amount of inches into that bale that spoils due to all those things like setting it on a wet area, leaving it out in the open. We always talk about the thatch layer, right? The oxidative tannins that basically will protect the inside of that bale, but you're still going to have some losses.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if we're looking at a 5x6 bale, a 1,000-pound bale, and you're talking about 1 inch of spoilage around the outside, you're going to lose 6% of that bale. If you really have it in a bad area where you can see the spoilage 3 inches deep into that bale, you're looking at 20% losses. And at 6% spoilage, you're looking at 36% loss of that bale. So really, if you have 3 bales and they all have 6-inch spoilage, that is a whole bale that you've wasted. So, you think about the price of hay and you think about how much you're losing when you have 30, 40, 50 bales. That 6-inch spoilage can really add up. I mean, I would say that 20% loss from the 3-inch spoilage is really going to add up.
It is.
So keeping things minimal to zero is the best way to make sure that you are protecting your money and you're actually using that hay in a way that will pay you back in the long run.
Right. And making sure you have the right moisture content when you're harvesting and baling is going to be key in helping to reduce that loss. But before we run out of time, I do want to touch a little bit on hay temperature. You should have a thermometer that is long enough to go into a hay bale and keep it handy and just check your bales every so often, especially if it was a little humid or a lot humid when you put them up, just to make sure that they are maintaining a safe temperature. Because once they get above that 130 degree mark, then you're starting to see the denaturing of proteins and caramelization of those sugars, that browning that Dan was just talking about. But you can also have the growth of fungi and bacteria that can, or mycotoxin development. Those can all make your animals sick. But once you get above that 165 or so, then you're starting to look at potential fire dangers. 175. Fire is imminent, so you don't want to get up there. And if your hay does get over 170, we'll even say, then you want to call the fire department before you start moving that hay around, because an influx of oxygen could cause the hay to combust. So you want to check your hay temperatures 2 to 4 times a day.
It typically peaks at about a week.
If you have noticed it getting warm, like if it's getting above 130, you're going to start checking it more frequently and try to increase your circulation of air in the haystack. But once it gets over 165, then you're starting to get into that danger zone. So don't lose your barn to fire this year because your hay was a little too moist when you were put it up. Get a moisture tester, check to make sure your moisture content is correct when you're baling, and then monitor the temperature of your hay as it is getting into its stasis point.
Right. And ideally, you don't want it to go above 130 for post-baling sweat. It typically peaks at about a week. So that is a critical time to do it. And if it does get in those temperatures that Karen was talking about, 140, 160, and 170, those are negative indicators for quality and possible dangers.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.